Um, we're in the midst of a climate crisis. Don't think the pandemic is any separate to this. The pandemic itself is rooted in pathogens jumping between species as a result of environmental degradation. We have certainly had scientists for the last 30 years in the IPCC Health Committee saying that we can expect a century of pandemics going forward, that this is the new norm. We are experiencing climate impacts in bushfires in Australia, or wildfires in California, or floods in Bangladesh, or in China. We have seen unbelievable climate incidents this year, and we're entering a northern winter, which is expected to be quite cold on the continents, but unbelievably hot in the Arctic, where it currently is already way above normal temperatures. These are signs of climate volatility beginning to hit. As we see more climate change coming through, we can expect much more in the way of volatility. We're on a race now, we're in a race. And the race is to see whether we can get emissions down fast enough to ensure that we don't hit the kind of climate change that we have no chance of avoiding catastrophic consequences for. The International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that we need to get global emissions, average emissions, down 55% on 1990 levels by 2030 to have a reasonable chance, only a reasonable chance, folks, a reasonable chance of having a future for our children. Ursula von der Leyen in Europe has committed Europe to that particular target. The member states and Parliament have yet to agree, but they have committed to 2050 net zero targets, as has Korea, Japan, the incoming Biden administration in the US, and China's committed to 2060 carbon neutrality. Things are changing. The question is, will it be fast enough? We must get emissions down rapidly. Now, that isn't just a matter of building out green investments like solar or wind or shifting to rail. It is also tackling the high carbon and high greenhouse gas emitting industries, which we need. We need steel. We need it for our bicycles, let alone our electric vehicles. We need concrete. We will continue to use concrete at scale, which is, by the way, responsible for about 7% of global emissions. We need aluminium and other metals. We need to start getting tough on transition to ensure that these kinds of assets and industries can remain relevant, but still make the shift to becoming zero or net zero carbon. And that's, for us, what this is primarily about. And the question is the ambition involved in doing it. We haven't got till 2050 or 2060 or 2070 to make these changes. We need to see the bulk of changes in the next 10 years. We need to know we're on the road to a clean and green economy by 2030. That's how we'll know with some kind of future for our children. So let me get into the detail of it a little bit. We have with us today a bunch of stellar speakers, amazing speakers. We have Marissa Drew, our good friend, the Chief Sustainability Officer of Credit Suisse, who has been talking about transitions non-stop for the past year, with recent media stories in Bloomberg and the Financial Times and others. So you'll see a lot of commentating. You'll see Anna Creed, who's our head of standards and is the person behind the policy framework that we've been developing at Climate Bonds Initiative. But we are also privileged to have with us Adam Matthews, who's the Director of Ethics and Engagement at the Church of England Pension Fund, some 11 billion under management, I think, but perhaps also, or more interestingly in some ways, he's the co-chair of the Transition Pathways Initiative, which is a project between the Principles for Responsible Investments, London School of Economics, Grantham Institute, and FTSE, with about $7 trillion of assets represented in its group, to develop exactly what the name says, transition pathways. And at Climate Bonds, we're going to be working closely, we hope, with TPI next year on developing solutions and directions here. He's also an active member of the Climate Action 100 Plus. He, for example, co-led the engagement of investors with Shell, which has, I have to say, paid amazing dividends in terms of changes or Shell corporate policy. Adam will talk a little bit about that later. And then we have the famous, or perhaps infamous, Stephen Liberatore, who's the managing director and the head of ESG impact at the $1 trillion assets under management Nuveen Fund, which, for those of you that are a bit old like me, is the asset manager side of the Teachers, Insurers and Annuity Association, TIAA. So it used to be called TIAA-CREF, and now we use the word Nuveen. And of course, Stephen's been pioneering the engagement and the investment on the part of Nuveen in sustainable assets for more years than I can think of. We're going to talk a little bit about what transition means for investors, for banks, and for our economy and our society going forward. Let me just start you off with a quick look at a couple of slides to give you an idea of what we're thinking about at climate bonds going forward. So we have this idea that there are many pathways to Paris, many pathways to one heaven if we can actually achieve that Paris Agreement target. Transition is one of them. Think of it as a bunch of different flavors of ice cream. You can't have a transition to nowhere. We need a transition. We all desperately need a transition to the Paris Agreement. But along that way, it's all ice cream. There are many flavors of ice cream. We have green labels, green ice cream. We have blue as well, projects relevant to oceans or water sustainability. We have resilience ice cream, projects relevant or investment relevant to making our societies more resilient in the face of the climate impacts that we have already started experiencing. And there are sustainability investments as well. We've seen the European Commission issue just a few days ago another tranche of AAA rated social bonds, which fall broadly under the sustainability label. And they've done something like 28 billion euros worth so far. By the way, vast investor demand. And now we have a transition label, which is tackling the difficult areas, the high carbon, the high GHG areas of the economy, and looking at how they fit in this mixture. So we're not talking about something which is entirely separate. We are talking about different aspects of the same knotty problem of addressing our environmental challenges. And that means our environmental challenge, which dominates everything, which is climate change. If we don't fix climate change, we don't stop the degradation of that environment, the collapse of biodiversities. We don't stop health impacts in cities in Delhi and Jakarta and even London from polluted air. We don't stop so many things. We have to get it right. So look, that's the background to what we're doing. I want to ask Anna to talk a little bit about the different kinds of frameworks that we have going forward. We're looking at a number of instruments: use of proceeds bonds, asset-backed security, green loans, equity, even sustainably linked bonds and general purpose bonds. Tell us, Anna, about the underpinnings of this. Explain.
Great, thanks, Sean, and very nice. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody on the call. So we set out a year ago now to think about what transition actually means in practice. Obviously, CBI generally comes from a use of proceeds bonds world, but really we were just trying to take a first step back to say, actually, aside from the financial instrument, what does transition mean in the real world? That's the most important thing that we're trying to get to here. And so we looked at what's the nature of transition? How would you describe the types of transitions people need to make? And obviously it's very interconnected. You transition an entity because ultimately you want to transition entities and whole sectors. How do you do that? You do that by changing their processes, by changing their fuel sources, by taking individual measures or interventions within activities. If you change enough of those measures and interventions, you will change the profile of the economic activity, the production process, the manufacturing process, etc. And then if you're changing that across all of your business, all of the activities you practice, that's how we're going to change whole entities and therefore whole economies, industries, sectors, and then whole economies. So it's very much a kind of building up basis from the individual measures up to activities and then to transitioning whole entities. And that's why the framework that we've put forward and the principles that we've put forward in our white paper, which we released in draft form in September, is very much geared towards actually what does it take? What's a credible transition on the ground in terms of these measures and transitioning entities and activities? And then how does that apply to financial instruments and the financing of those transitions? So with that kind of basis of this is what it takes on the ground, then you can see actually, therefore, we can apply this framework and the principles we're putting forward to use of proceeds bonds, which actually focus often more on individual measures or projects or whole assets if you're refinancing or a whole asset or mortgage on it, for example. Similarly, for asset-backed securities and green loans, they're much more targeted in the way that we generally see in the green bond market. But actually, because we're talking about what does it take to transition a whole entity, that opens up for us the ability to use the framework and the principles we're putting forward to evaluate the entities themselves, obviously, and the strategies they're putting forward for their transition, if that's the level at which you're looking as an evaluating entity. But then off the back of that, all their financial instruments that fund that, so equity investments, sustainability-linked bonds or loans, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that builds up into this kind of hierarchy in a sense. And so there's just some examples on this slide of how that works. So we've talked about measures to reduce emissions. So here we've got electrical entities, so stopping gas flaring, closing plants early, upgrading gas networks for green hydrogen, etc. Those kind of measures will really change the nature of the entity's activities. And over time, if they do enough of that across all of their activities, going to change the entities. And that's effectively what we're looking at trying to tackle. On the next slides, Sean, if you want me to go on and just talk about the other two in parallel.
Let me just draw everyone's attention to that green general purpose bond and sustainability linked bond. Where we're going here is getting granular information to be able to make an assessment about a corporation's transition plan. Now, that might mean that we end up saying all of a company's bonds, not to mention other investments, would qualify. This is, of course, what TPI and others have been working on and looking at. It's also a means of providing some rigor to the sustainability linked bond and loan market. This has been a very interesting development in the last couple of years, especially sustainability linked loans, where there is a promise by a company to achieve a certain target and there's a penalty if they don't achieve the target. We think this is going to grow, but we think also it'll be very useful for investors to have greater understanding of what the actual nature of transition is in that sector that needs to be achieved to be able to assess the nature of the promises, whether it's a sustainability linked bond or loan against a project or an asset, or whether it's a company-wide one. So our ambition is to provide colour around that to really make this market grow fantastically with rigour. Just wanted to throw that in, point people to it. But please, Anna, go on.
Yeah, so following on from that and picking up on what Sean said earlier, so for us, transition is inclusive. What we're really trying to capture here is that whole economies need to transition across all sectors and all countries. And that means that for some activities, we've identified in the paper sort of 6 different categories of economic activities based on their kind of the long-term need for them and the potential to decarbonise them. But in essence, what we're trying to get to here is that the transition is slightly different, but everybody needs to be transitioning in some way. For some, on the stranded asset side, or the stranded activity side, it's about really changing your business model, moving away from activity X towards activity Y and doing that at speed and basically transitioning things away at their sunset dates. Interim is very similar. It's just that they might have a short-term role to play, so their sunset dates are a bit later. But for other activities, like the sort of things that Sean mentioned earlier, so cement and steel production, for example, it's really about decarbonising those activities. Keep pursuing them, but decarbonise them very rapidly so that they are actually aligned with a net zero economy and the Paris Agreement, essentially. And I think this is really critical as well, because the other point to make about this kind of inclusivity of transition is not just their emissions profile, but I guess the point I want to make here is it's not just about hard to abate sectors. They're obviously really critical, but it's also about all the other sectors which enable that. So the move to supporting hydrogen, for example, to CCS, manufacturing of low carbon technologies, or transitioning or technologies which enable other people to transition. There's that whole enabling space, which is a really key part of transition. And it's also sectors like agriculture, for example, that can be very high emissions at the moment, actually have the potential to be net negative emissions if we really turn the agriculture sector around and start storing a lot of carbon in the land through at the same time as our agricultural food and feed and fiber production. So that all of these sectors need to transition, but in slightly different ways each time, which is what makes it interesting and challenging, I guess, to know what's happening with them. And then how do we know what's a credible transition on that basis? So the next slide just has a summary of 5 key principles which we would like to see met, because these will be indicators of a credible, ambitious transition that is effectively aligned with the Paris Agreement goals. And so they provide good guidelines for what we want to see in transition activity and instruments in the market. So the first 2 actually, I guess, key headlines to take away from this, we would stress strongly to the market that this needs to be guided by the science and the scientific community. And we need to be really ambitious here. As Sean said earlier, a lot of these scenarios, the Paris Agreement committed countries to below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. Even the scenarios for 1.5 degrees only give us a 2/3 chance of actually hitting those. So we need to be really ambitious here in terms of following those kind of scenarios to give us a reasonable chance of meeting these kind of targets that we've agreed to. And like I said, established by the scientific and the technological community, not by policymakers. Unfortunately, at the moment, we can't rely on NDCs to give us these pathways and decarbonisation trajectories, because we know they don't add up to the goals that we need to be meeting, and we've agreed collectively that we will meet. So at the moment, they're not robust enough to give us that kind of guidance. I guess the other one I'd call out very quickly on here is number 5, action, not pledges. We are already in the need to be making very substantial changes. It's not about making promises for 2050 or even 2030, remembering that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. We need to see that people are already taking the actions. Their CapEx base is changing, their revenue streams, current and projected, are changing. If they're in a case of moving away from stranded activities, for example, all of this stuff needs to be happening already. And so if we're talking about a credible transition, it's about actually what you're doing now to put that in place that's already starting to deliver, but it's very tangible steps towards those future incremental, significantly incremental changes, not just about pledges, promises, governance, policies, etc. It needs to be a lot more than that, given the state of play and where we are today. So that's probably all I'd say at this stage, Sean, unless you want to pick up on any of that.
No, that's great. Marissa, can I come to you? Because we've been working on this now for quite some time. Can you give us a bit of background to all of this in terms of what you're seeing in the market and the opportunity you're seeing from a commercial perspective?
Sure. So I think philosophically, the idea behind this whole effort was bringing together what we saw as a gap in the marketplace, whereby we have companies that do want to transition. They're genuinely serious about it. They may be in a hard to abate or high carbon emitting sector, and they were feeling that they would like a dedicated pool of capital to help fund this transition. And if you look to the UN, they will tell you that we need about $35 trillion worth of investment if we're going to fully decarbonize the world. 35 trillion. So the funding needs to come. And the funding cannot come solely from governments. We really need the markets to step in here in a material way. And whilst the green bond market is incredibly efficient, has scaled to $1 trillion of outstandings, there or thereabouts, it isn't necessarily designed for those high carbon emitting industries and whole entity transitions. So we saw a gap from the issuer's point of view, and we have some wonderful investors here with us who could probably corroborate the fact that we also see a gap from the investor's point of view. The investment community wants to help fund these transitions. We were hearing it on a regular basis from our constituents. And then, of course, broader civil society is asking us to get there. So all of these things baked together said to us, there's got to be a way that we can create some sort of a framework or standard. As you pointed out, Sean, rigor is what we need, because that gives confidence to markets, and then markets can scale. So that was the idea behind this. As Anna said, we did a year's worth of work to try to come up with some of these principles and frameworks, but we also want to acknowledge that we have no lock on all the ideas here. We want to crowd in good thinking, good process, good feedback in order to make this a living, breathing effort that is inclusive and market adopted. So where we stand today is that we continue to get feedback, And I think we should dive into some of the topics that we have heard from different constituents, whether they be issuers or investors or civil society, as to what are some of the question marks around the concept of transition. So first and foremost, there continues to be a bit of a debate. Is a transition label needed? And I'd like to turn it to our investors to answer that question. I firmly believe it's needed because it's happening. So in the absence of a framework, we're seeing it every day. Today, Sanam just issued a transition bond of 600 million. Transition labeled bond. So there we go with another issuer in the market with its own framework. Very much aligned, by the way, with the principles that we have here. But wouldn't it be nice if we could have a collective view and an agreement of what transition means? I think the second topic that we've gotten feedback on, and I think once again, we'd love to dive into this one, is this really tricky question of carbon offsets. I know that carbon offsets are a big portion of how many of our clients are getting to an ambition towards net zero. And we think, I certainly think, and I'd love the debate to happen, is that carbon emissions in the interim, carbon offsets rather, in the interim are helpful. But if we don't ultimately get on a net basis companies to reduce their activities, not buying offsets from somebody else, we can't achieve this collective ambition. So these are people are giving us feedback saying, well, gee, I don't have another plan, right? If I can't use carbon offsets to help me get there, today I don't have an answer. And I do think we have to acknowledge in this framework that part of the concept of transition is we may not have all the answers today. So maybe there's an interim period where one strategy works, but that's a bridge toward a brighter day when maybe there's technological innovation or process innovation that allows us to have a much greener solution. So I want to stop there and open up the debate and invite in particular both Adam and Stephen to maybe comment on some of these topics and your perspectives as investors in this arena.
So Adam, over to you. Thanks, Marissa. I mean, maybe the question about where carbon offsets and could or could not be used also relates to the pathway of a particular sector. You've been looking at this in your role in the Transition Pathways Initiative, for example. Where's your thinking going in the work you're doing, including at the Climate Action 100 Plus?
And well, first of all, just to note what a helpful contribution the paper and the proposed framework is, and credit to the respective entities that stood behind it and produced it, because I think it's a really good contribution and framing of how we can look at this quite practically. I'm also conscious a number of us are involved in the ICMA work as well, and that's coming up shortly too. And I think these are both complementary to sort of achieving, in effect, as a standard on enabling the transition. I mean, from the perspective of the Transition Pathway Initiative, obviously at the moment it's a tool that supports investors, 23 trillion of them, in understanding companies transitioning from high carbon intensive sectors in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, who's actually genuinely putting in place the strategies to transition and who isn't. And it's at the moment focused on listed equities, but we are expanding the tool to enable corporate bonds. There's a lot of crossover in the analysis between listed companies, but obviously there's a range of other companies that aren't listed that are raising bonds, and we do intend to cover in the first half of next year. So that part of TPI's evolution will be there to support investors. And I think we're at a really interesting moment where the sort of understanding of what it genuinely means to transition for a company at an entity level is becoming quite clear. And I think Climate Action 100, the sort of 48 trillion, 500 investor global engagement initiative, has now developed a framework using TPI that will be published in February. And that really, I think, starts to pin down transition for individual companies in a way and a level of sort of public disclosure requirement that really takes a big jump ahead. And we need to align that to how we can unleash the role that we can additionally play in providing the finance through bonds, both at a company level and equally specifically to enable the transition. And I think this is where the sort of work needs to be done between, I think, everyone on this call and I suspect many people in the audience, to really sort of define the frameworks now for transition on these pathways, develop the standard, and then really sort of enable a framework that can provide the confidence to investors to provide that many trillions of finance that's needed. It's absolutely perfectly possible for a high carbon company in an energy intensive sector to transition. I've no doubt a steel company, cement company can, if it has the right strategy. We need independent verification that their strategy is credible, their targets align to the goals of the Paris Agreement, that they have a clear capability in the management, and that they know the interventions they're to make. I get the point that some of this is going to be dependent on technologies that are yet to emerge at a scale, and I think that's where companies need to be very specific about identifying their strategy, their needs on certain technologies, their needs in certain offsets, and then in that context, putting that to independent verification to enable us to then assess and have confidence in the context of the pathway they're seeing. And I think the engagement through Climate Action 100 will evolve. We're looking now at the next phase of climate action beyond the individual engagement we're having with the top 161 companies to looking at the connection with whole value chains. I know, for example, with Shell, for them to decarbonize requires actions through multiple value chains, and we need to establish those net zero pathways, build the accountability framework, and then I think on the basis of that, you can hope that the finance will flow.
Stephen, do you think he's right that the finance will flow? I note that US Steel was in the market a few days ago with a modest green bond to finance electric arc furnaces and so on. I don't know how it's gone. What do you think about this thing about will the finance flow or can it flow?
Yeah, first off, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be amongst, distinguished leaders in this space for all of these years. And Sean, I appreciate you taking the nicest possible way of calling me old earlier. So thank you for that. I think Adam's absolutely right. I think that what we have found on our side in having worked with our investors, we generally look at any type of impactful security through the framework that we had established back in 2007, which is our impact framework. And what we're trying to do is really focus on how do we control the use of proceeds. We're very much aligned with CBI and with what Adam was saying as being focused kind of on that use of proceeds focus. Not saying there aren't other possibilities and potential very interesting structures, sustainability linked is not something we currently fits for us, but we could see potential for that in the future. But for us, it's really about focusing on how do we use our investors, their capital in a way that allows us to drive true change. Transition is a very challenging topic, right? That's part of the reason we're having this conversation, and it's something that we work on and look at. And for us, when we think of a transition security, we think of something that means exactly what it says, actually transitioning an issuer to a more sustainable path. And that can take a variety of forms, but we think that the best way that we've seen to date really is the utilization of the use of proceeds concept. It's, are we able to fund specific projects that truly demonstrate that an issuer, and then hopefully then subsequently an entire sector, can change? One of the ones that we spend a lot of time talking to oil and gas companies, and obviously what we're trying to do there is to get them to, again, transition away from the extraction of fossil fuels. And the way that we think that would work, and something we talk to all of them about, is how do we make an investment or get the opportunity to invest in their renewable subsidiary, right? All of the major, E&P companies have very material renewables businesses for them. And to us, that's an indication immediately that management and shareholders of those firms recognize that there has to be a shift away from fossil fuel utilization in the long run, and have started to effectively hedge their bets a little bit by starting to invest pretty materially in renewable subsidiaries. And that to us is a really good opportunity, because what we want to do is we want to be able to effectively help to lower the cost of capital for renewable projects, for more sustainable projects, and make them more cost competitive to fossil fuel utilization or the continued adoption of or extraction of fossil fuels. And the easiest way to do that, we think, is really to get that use of proceeds focus and allow for us to invest in ways that an issuer is able to obtain better financing or different types of financing that maybe are not available to them currently, and then make it a true capitalist decision of, hey, it's cheaper for us and better for us in the long run. We have better returns investing in more offshore wind instead of drilling another hole in the, drilling another well in the North Sea, for example, and that we think is really the way to transition it, because as Marissa said, we need $35 trillion. Unfortunately, there's not $35 trillion worth of grant money, but there is $35 trillion worth of investment capital. And if you're able to make this a situation where you can make a argument from a pure capitalist profitability, sustainability argument, that really what we're supposed to be focused on is, or are, these new types of businesses and in forming a transition process, then I think you're going to be able to get more and more investors involved. And I think that's really the key.
I mean, I'd love to jump in here just with one point, is that, a decade or so ago, when we were at the very beginning of wind and solar, and the price of that unit cost of energy was so much higher than fossil fuels, we needed that little nudge to get to a point where you can scale. But once you scale, you hit that tipping point, and now that energy cost is 85% less than what it was a decade ago, and now it is cheaper per unit of production. So this is the sort of thing I think you're talking about, Stephen, right. Is if we can get that capital to flow, the commercial reality takes on a life of its own, and it becomes that much more compelling, and it's self-fulfilling.
And I think, Marissa, that's exactly it. Here in the U.S., for example, one of the things, unfortunately, our political leaders don't do a great job of really representing where we have a lot of commonality. One of the most widely accepted and most supported concepts here in the U.S. is obviously renewables. It doesn't matter where you are on a political spectrum, and that's translated to a concept in a situation where, if you live in the Southwest, for example, in the US, your cheapest marginal form of power is solar. If you live in the Midwest, it's actually wind. So we're getting to a place where you're starting to see that tipping point in the capitalist argument of, okay, it's now a cost issue and it's a return-based issue. And I think really the next step here that you're going to see globally is, if we're able to continue, and I think this is how you can use the power of finance to help to address some of these issues, is if we're able to get one of the areas I think is really interesting and continues to grow is in the concept of solar ABS. And the reason I think it's really important and interesting, and this is obviously an area that CS has been a clear leader on, going back to issuing the first solar loan and lease transaction for Solar City, which has since been absorbed, is that you're starting to get opportunities for individuals to see how they benefit from transitioning and moving to a more sustainable path. The argument you will always hear, right, depending upon where you are, is going to be that transitioning to utilization of renewables is more expensive. It's going to cost you more money as a consumer. And that's a negative for certain. But when you start looking at solar ABS, for example, where individuals are able to purchase solar arrays that are becoming cheaper and cheaper, as you pointed out, Marissa, and if you're able to provide better financing over time, then the financing costs come down. And then what you're able to argue to people is actually the transition to a more sustainable future and using renewables, for example, actually puts you in a position where you save money. You actually are saving money over time. And then I think the individual is able to see how they personally benefit from what we're talking about here. Whereas now it's a little bit more abstract still, because they're driving down the road and they see, oh, there's a solar farm powering, an Apple data farm, an Apple data business. That's interesting for sure, but it's not personal. It's not visceral for them, how they can see the benefit. So I think that's where we have to try to go, is targeting the opportunity to lower the cost of capital for everyone, and that would drive more interest for sure.
Absolutely correct. For all our listeners, this is being recorded and simultaneously broadcast on YouTube as well. So you can switch to YouTube if you're having problems with Zoom, but the most important thing, you'll be able to get a recording on YouTube at the Climate Bonds Initiative channel or via climatebonds.net/webinars. There will be a podcast made of this as well. So please share with your friends if you find it interesting. Adam, you've been involved in the Shell story. And we've had a few questions picking up from Stephen's comment earlier about oil and gas industry. What does transition look like in that particular sector? Where are you going? Where's that engagement going with the Climate Action 100 Plus, and how does it fit into what we're talking about here, trying to identify instruments, starting a few Prozis instruments that might qualify?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a fascinating journey on the engagement with Shell, and I lead obviously on behalf of the wider Climate Action 100. So you're the sort of the representatives of that very large shareholder base as such, and also bondholders, and do so with Robeco, who we sort of tag team in the engagement, and it's been a really in-depth, continuous engagement. We talk continuously with Shell 3-4 times a week, and at one level, it was like, well, okay, can you demonstrate to us you've got an understanding of the transition at a company level? And then really once you've got that, what are your targets? What's your long term? What's your medium? What's your short term? How does that then translate into the transition plan for the company? And then really, what are the levers that are in your control that you can pull as a company, whilst you're acknowledging there are other levers that you want to see pulled that aren't in control of you, that you can influence but you can't control. And then really, how does that sort of fit together as a strategy as we acknowledge your relationship and responsibility to Scope 3 emissions as well as Scope 1 and 2. And so over the past years, we've been able to build up an agreement between Climate Action 100 and Shell, which initially put in a framework, which also included their public policy lobbying, and set in place the connection to executive remuneration and targets. And then we continue dialogue. We now have a net zero commitment. And for me, the most interesting development really was at the beginning of the pandemic. You had Ben van Beurden announce that they're willing to not sell energy or pivot away from, in more comfortable language, from those customers that they supply energy to that can't themselves demonstrate they're in net zero pathways. And this really sort of underlined the connection with these value chains that are going to determine whether Shell can actually transition, where Shell can influence and put sort of offer fuels and sort of energy efficiency measures, etc., into these pathways and work with them, but actually it's going to be up to their customers. And so now you're seeing this evolution of a strategy that is dependent on what happens in road haulage, in the auto sector, aviation, shipping, and equally in other sectors like steel and cement. And we're working with Shell, we're working with a range of other companies now, as CA100, to understand the complexity of those linkages, what a net zero pathway is for these different sectors, and then really what are the options that we have, both in terms of the regulatory changes we want to see, because I think now we're moving into territory where we have a shared objective of net zero, but we also have a potential shared objective to lobby regulators together to achieve it. And then really, what are the technological inputs that are needed to enhance that transition through these different value chains? And where could finance play an enhancing role that actually accelerates the transition? Now, I still think we're in the early stages of this, and I think the work that this paper talks to in terms of the framing is equally part of this package. And I think we need to bring these processes together. So it's not just us engaging as shareholders, it's us engaging as bondholders together, understanding these pathways, building out a very clear framework so a company like Shell and many of the companies through those value chains can be connected in a credible net zero path, and that we've got that clarity of knowing where these interventions need to be made, where the finance needs to support, and then you've got the independent accountability of tools like TPI that can track the individual company and then through the value chain. And I think that's the stage we're at, and that's where the work we're doing with the Swedish AP funds and CalPERS in terms of understanding that sectoral approach is sort of taking engagement.
So there's quite complex. Sorry, go ahead, Marisa.
Question, just because you talk about this engagement, and we jumped over it a little bit, this concept of offsets and how you think about it, because it is a hurdle for some of these issuers when they think about transition. As an investor, what is your position on it? How do you feel? I'd love to hear from both Adam and Stephen on the topic, if you're willing.
Well, to be honest, I think we need to be much clearer in what's the position of Climate Action 100 in relation to it. And there is work underway through the Institutional Investors Group in Europe, IIGCC, to have a clear articulation of European investors on this issue, and equally on CCUS. From a sort of technical perspective, we recognise there's an absolute role for these both offsets and equally for CCUS. However, and it is a big however, we want clarity rather than these things being presented as, okay, there's this massive chunk from CCUS and it's going to play this huge role. We need it much more practically defined. We've had these concepts talked around for far too long, and it's at the point now, if CCUS is capture is going to play a role in the transition of steel sector, I want to see the feasibility studies of the site levels where it's going to play a role. If I know it's going to play 10%, 15%, 20% of a role in the steel transition, then fine. Which of those sites that it relates to, get specific, get very practical and identify that. And then I think we can get the handle on the role these different interventions will play. There is an ability to use offsets. I think that is something that can be used, but again, I want to have a very clear understanding the role it's going to play, exactly how much is going to be required, and in anticipation of what other technologies and what timeline, etc., could then displace that dependence. And so I think from my perspective, we need to be much clearer in sort of outlining our perspective on them. And I think engagement has sort of got down from the level we want the net zero commitment. We've got that. We now want the short-term, medium-term targets. Okay, we've now got that. We now want the transition plan. Okay, we're starting to get that. We now need to test the transition plan and the assumptions within the transition plan. Okay, we need to see how that relates to your capital expenditure, etc. And I think these are all the stages that engagement is going through at the moment. And then the linkage through from the companies through their value chains and the transition pathways. So I don't rule them out, but I do want to see much greater clarity.
And in the EU taxonomy, it's worth noting where CCS is allowed, you have to actually have signed a contract to build it to include it. You can't promise. So CCS ready is not allowed under the European Union taxonomy. And I think that's an example of what you mean. Let's make it granular, let's make it concrete, and it's actually got to be an action, not a pledge, which is a key part of it. The offsets question is interesting. I mean, you know, I personally, but we've got to look at this, of course, am not keen on an offsets approach at all in electricity generation. I do not see the need. We can see a transition. But in aviation, there may be something to do. Now, don't get me wrong. I do not believe replacing kerosene with slightly more efficient kerosene is a way forward. I'm not a fan of the Etihad transition bond a few weeks ago along these lines, which had a bit of that in there. Good try, transparency, but some debate around that. However, if you're moving to biofuels, as distinct from battery, which is going to be tough for a while, which gives you about a 60% reduction in emissions, then maybe that could be allowed with some offsetting for the emissions that are still there, which could help finance our tropical rainforest retention that is so desperately in need of a carbon price. So I think the challenge is to look for specific granular areas where alternative options aren't available, but we need this industry to keep, we will have this industry keep working. And how do we use offsets in those mechanisms? So clearly there is an argument there to be had in some sectors, Marissa. But the other thing is sustainability-linked loans, right? This is a new idea, and bonds, which is developed. I'm going to say a little bit of a wild west when it comes to the nature of the promises and whether they're real or not. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's been some really interesting promises. I quite liked Suzano's sustainability-linked bond from Brazil into New York, which was pretty well received. But of course, against that is an idea of, well, what do we do in agriculture? Is this ambitious enough? So Anna, you mentioned earlier agriculture. What does a transition look like in agriculture? What have we got to start thinking about? You're on mute, Anna.
Yeah, definitely on agriculture. I'd like also to respond to the offsets one, and it's actually a linked point. In agriculture, it's really about, I think, like I mentioned earlier, it's a really interesting sector because it's got the potential to store carbon. And so the point is here about actually, yes, it's about avoiding significant land use change and reducing emissions, but actually changing the way in which people use the soils, to think about storing carbon in the soil, their animal management, their manure management, and then the obvious things like the energy they use on site, which is relatively immaterial for this sector. It's really about soil and animal management for this sector. But there is massive potential here to actually make this a net sink, and we should be making it a net sink. And that's why on that basis, I'd probably come back to the offsets point. For me, what we've said in the paper is that the goal is a net zero economy. It doesn't mean that every sector is going to get to net zero at the same year. Maybe some of them won't get to net zero for a long time, but some should be going a lot earlier. Agriculture could go earlier, land-based transport with electric vehicles could go a lot earlier. And I think this is where transition gets complicated. When you add all the sectors together, the goal is a net zero economy, but not every sector is going to be on the same kind of decarbonisation pathway to the same, it's the same goal, but it might be a different end date, some earlier, some slightly later. And that's why for me, from a technical point of view, I prefer to see offsets cut out. I think it's much better to say being really ambitious for a sector and what you can actually do directly through your value chains, everything else, but what can you actually achieve? And let's set transition pathways and targets based on what can be controlled yourself and focus on what can be done in the other sectors as well. I'm thinking more about kind of forestry offsets type thing here, and just keep it clean and be realistic but ambitious about what can be done by every sector and focus attention on what you actually need to be doing directly and through your value chains. I think a lot can be done that way, and we need to be focused on that kind of discussion and transition that people need to be pushing towards in their own control. Yeah.
Stephen, muy complicado, but you're wrestling with this on a day-to-day basis. What are you seeing that takes us in this direction? What are your thoughts about the ideas that we've just been throwing up?
Yeah, I think that obviously one of the things that we want to make sure we get across, or we try to get across, is we want all issuers, and regardless of the industry or sector they work in, to recognize that everybody has a potential to making their own business more sustainable. So, the offset concept, is not one, generally speaking, that we would be tremendously supportive of, because we feel like maybe that's a little bit of an easy way out and doesn't really encourage an issuer to really change their behavior. Now, granted, there's always, the answer is always depends, right? Like I think about the IFC forest bond, for example, where in the Kasagau forest, there was a shift there for the indigenous population to being more sustainable in their livelihoods, right? Having a more sustainable farming, more sustainable ranching, more sustainable approach to life, which then generated carbon offsets, which then BHP was able to purchase to help fund the security and fund the projects themselves. So there certainly are potentials, but you would want to see issuers taking a further step from that for sure. It's a great concept to certainly start and maybe fund very unique projects or very unique opportunities. But you want to take everybody taking that step further, because everybody can do something differently in making themselves more sustainable. And the reality is for us, is the issuers are the ones that best understand their own industries. They're the ones that are going to be able to identify where the opportunities are for them to become more sustainable in a variety of ways, right? Even nothing more than just energy efficiency alone could reduce, energy utilization 20-25%, which is vastly material, on a global basis. So it's a tough, there's some potential there depending, but I think you want it to be a little bit more ambitious and a little bit more forward looking, and have issuers recognize that there is potential for them, and not just kind of throw their hands up and say, well, that might be too difficult, we'll just buy some carbon offsets. That's not really what I think is going to help us really move forward and really transition the global economy as a whole to something that's more sustainable.
It's a really good point. So we have to be very careful about this and whether it works. And perhaps Anna's point that what's really needed are what are credible transitions. We've had a lot of questions coming through about what's stopping us move faster, what's stopping us move faster in agriculture, what's stopping us move faster global engagement of capital, and so on. Can I get you all from your each perspective? I mean, from Marissa, in terms of deals, we've got a shortage of supply in this market. What's stopping us? From Stephen, what are the barriers to more capital flowing? Adam, maybe start with you. What do you see as the big barriers, the next step? What's stopping us make this transition fast enough?
I sort of feel that we're on the cusp of really picking up speed. I feel actually quite energized and excited by it, energized in a low carbon way, of course, just in the sense that I feel that engagement on the equity side has got to a point where we're really looking at and having discussions with what a genuine transition plan is for a company. And I think that understanding is going to move very quickly over the next 12 months. And I think with your paper, with the work that ICMA's doing, I think we can now see the kind of framing that's needed on the bond side. And I think if we can bring these tracks together over this coming year, really understand credibly what a transparent transition plan is that can give sufficient confidence to the finance sector, that can then really be independently tracked, then I think we're sort of in the place that we can start to move this a lot quicker. I also think you've got the other pressure in the system that's really starting to come through of increasing government expectations on pension funds to be making their own commitments to be net zero. And that flows down in terms of how you do that at an asset allocation level, how you do that within individual asset classes. And again, I think that's going to be a positive pressure into the system. So my sense is that we just need to do more of what we're doing faster. We need to do great work in the way that we are in this paper and others, and with these groupings, and many of the people I think that are watching this discussion, in really looking at how we can move this in a practical way, and sort of, whilst at the same time acknowledging there needs to be that regulatory catch up on this, because it can't all be done by finance without a matching pull on the regulatory side. And there, I mean, it's obviously encouraging with the intent of the new incoming presidency in the US, but I do think we do need to develop what are the policy changes we want to see from governments, be it a European level, be it an international level, individual countries, that can also speed this up as our understanding of this transition grows.
That's a good connection back to you, Stephen, with an incoming administration, with people thinking part of the answer is, what would your advice be to an incoming administration? Okay, all yours.
No, absolutely. I think that having, here in the US, the vast majority of environmental regulation is done at the state and local level. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there is pretty broad support, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, for the increasing utilization of renewables, maybe for different reasons, but support nonetheless. So I think what you'll get at the federal level from the incoming administration is just more general support and leadership that maybe we haven't seen to date. Maybe pushing more environmentally beneficial types of regulation, or providing more incentives, or increasing the desire for renewable generation from a utility basis here, but also pushing for more energy efficiency, pushing for improved infrastructure here in the US to have a smarter grid, for example, so you can put more renewables on and have it operate in more base load type of a basis. I think also, what we have to do is, it's almost the same issue of why we haven't seen even more from both sides, both investor as well as issuer. The issuers still are, and I've talked to, and I just had the spreadsheet up this morning, I've had 78 different engagements with issuers this year, specifically around some type of impactful issuance. And the issues today for them remain what they were almost 10 years ago, which is there's still uncertainty around exactly what's expected of them. There's uncertainty around how they can approach it in a way that would be deemed credible, not just today, but also in the future, because their concern is, well, we come to market today with some type of impactful security for, relative to the environment, but 2 years from now, that's now deemed to be something that isn't beneficial. And now we're, basically in a situation where we have, a reputational risk that we're addressing. So I think the keys are, and it kind of backs into what Adam was saying as well, is it requires measurement. It requires a direct use of proceeds. It requires measurement where you can then track and follow and see how your dollars are being invested and ultimately what the benefits are from them. And I think that builds a level of credibility for both an investor as well as an issuer, and again, we're not there yet, and I hope we get there sometime in my lifetime, but we're not at a place really where we're arguing over, well, we're going to invest in solar project 2, not solar project 1, because 2 is more efficient, right? We're really not there yet. What we're arguing over is just getting more renewables to reduce the need for fossil fuel utilization. So I think that the measurement and the credibility derives from that measurement and the willingness of issuers to share that information and be, just transparent about, hey, here's the project, here's the concept of what we're doing, whether we're transitioning a portion of our business, all of our business, or we're just trying to become more sustainable. Here are the projects, here are the measurements around the environmental benefit, and allow the investor to make the determination of, is that something that you're wanting to be a part of? And I think that's really the key, going forward.
So in a sense, that would apply potentially to the sustainability linked loans and bonds market too. Marisa, I'm looking at you here really, because you've been looking at this question. So if we have the higher levels of transparency, linking it to pathways for transition in a sector, so you can look at an agri sustainability linked bond and understand how it really should be reporting on, or what it should be reporting, what the appropriate level of ambition is, then there may be more of a place in this particular market than these things that are kind of one-offs linked to their own targets without any kind of external referencing, right? I think, Marisa, this is the thing we see as a big opportunity.
Yeah, I
Don't
do
you think?
I think that's absolutely correct, because you asked what was the hurdle point? Why aren't we further along? And I think if we step back and say those, particularly in the high carbon emitting industries, it was considered to be a dirty term, right? They weren't allowed to access the green bond market because they were dirty industries. That was sort of the moniker. And so there's this reluctance both on the issuer side to put yourself out there because you don't want to be accused of greenwashing. On the other hand, from the investor's point of view, the last thing you want to do is put money to work in something that could be considered that you weren't rigorous enough in your analysis and you were funding greenwashing. So those two, I would say, perception issues have occurred in the marketplace, which is a little bit why we're saying here with this initiative, if we can create a framework that we all agree, that the market agrees is a credible way to look at it, and you're holding a high bar, and there's also some sort of consistency of standard for a given industry, then I think that gives confidence to both sides. So I would say that's sort of one issue. The second issue on the sustainability link topic, for the avoidance of doubt, because I do think there's been confusion as to whether the framework posed by the Climate Bond Initiative is in conflict in a way with sustainability linked loans and bonds. And for the avoidance of doubt, absolutely not. I actually think of this framework as the umbrella, which houses all sorts of different types, as Anna rightly pointed out, of issuances. Now, on the sustainability linked bit, I think it is the same exact issue when I hear from the investment community, and I'd be curious to hear from Adam and Stephen on this one, is that they generally love the idea that their hard metrics are targets and you're putting your money where your mouth is so that if you don't achieve, it's going to cost you something. On the other hand, I think there's a bit of skepticism about how ambitious those targets are. So if those targets are a little bit like, hey, I'm going to put something out there, but I was going to achieve it anyway, then where's the real rigor and the ambition of delivering something that is meaningful? So I do think when we talk about a framework and we say the targets have got to be ambitious, and science-backed and Paris-aligned, all of those things are markers, I think, of good hygiene in the market. And I just want to leave you with one point as well, because we also asked about, there was a very directed question on the screen about why, if there's 32 trillion of pension fund money that exists and it's going to cost us 35 trillion to decarbonize, how come we can't get all the pension funds in? Well, I think we're getting there. And I think this is where policy nudges actually really matter. In Europe, it is considered a part of your fiduciary duty now as a trustee of a pension fund to take the ESG into consideration. Under the existing administration in the US, the reverse is true. You almost have to prove that it's not going to hurt your returns if you run pension money, if you take the ESG into consideration. But I think under the Biden administration, it's going to flip right back, and they're going to align with Europe. And the more that you give comfort that this is the right direction as a trustee, again, all of this is about comfort factor as an investor or an issuer or a trustee or a fiduciary. That is what allows markets to scale. And I think that all coming together is we're sort of at that tipping point in a positive way, I think, as we go into 2021, because you see the regulators pushing it, you see the issuers wanting it, you see the investors wanting it. It's got to happen.
Folks, we need to be looking at wrapping up now. We've seen some major changes this past year in terms of ambition by European Union, about China, Japan, Korea, even Hong Kong's announced 2050 net zero commitments. And of course, the US is talking about doing so under a Biden administration, which provides a great background to this question: how do we actually get there? What does ambition to achieve those objectives look like? The truth is, we know in a lot of areas, but there are some areas where we don't know. We need more investigation. Take the maritime, aviation, and steel. As we've been looking in those sectors, we discovered the extent to which hydrogen, green hydrogen, is a turnkey solution. If you can get green hydrogen down to the cost of, say, gas now as a competitive fuel, then everything starts unfolding. We can shift the steel industry to low carbon super quick instead of 30 years that some industry players say it's going to take. We find ship owners saying, if you tell me hydrogen's available in Cape Town or Los Angeles, in San Diego or Los Angeles to buy, I will simply buy ships that buy that use hydrogen, and so on and so on. So the interesting part of this discussion is the complex nature of solutions that we have to unpack to identify the right CapEx pathways. We need to make it easy for people. And it isn't easy when you first look at it. As Adam, you found the Transition Pathways Institution, you worked there. We make it easy, then we preference it. And this year, Europe and other markets are going to see a lot of preferencing. Regulatory support, central bank support, blended finance, and so on, to ensure that Stephen can get some deals which suit his risk yield requirements. So that's the idea behind it. This does not replace carbon markets or emissions trading schemes. They happen in parallel, but it is a different paradigm going forward. So that's the background to it from our perspective. The real question now is, do we really have the money available? We've actually got about $100 trillion, by the way, in institutional investment capital globally. But of course, it's allocated to all sorts of things, including government bonds. We need to shift all sorts of instruments. Green sovereign bonds help in terms of a chance to allocate money. So there's a lot here that is happening at the moment. But we have 10 years to reduce emissions 55% on 1990 levels to have a reasonable chance for our future. I would like to wrap up asking our panelists on thoughts on them from a transitions perspective on getting there. What are we going to see next? Adam, can I start on you? You've been so enmeshed in this process in the last couple of years. What's next?
I'm just going to quickly note your point on sovereigns. I do think that ensuring that we're not just looking at a sovereign green, but actually the sovereign fund in the context of transition and the enabling regulatory environment of those sovereigns and all their underlying entities, be they state-owned operators, I think that will move. Equally, I think in terms of this space, I think we are now in this space of understanding what credible transition plans aligned to the science economics of climate, what they look like, into the detail, into some of the weeds. I think we're going to kill certain darlings in terms of the roles they're going to play. I think we get very specific. And I think those that approach it with transparency as their aid, I think will gain the confidence of their investors. And I think building out the frameworks and looking for where we can draw ourselves together with the work that's been done on the equity side, I think gives us real opportunity. So I'm hugely encouraged about the time ahead.
Anna, can I turn to you?
Yeah, just to build on that from a sort of more technical perspective, I agree. I think the frameworks are now in place. We see movement in things like the EU taxonomy where these high emission sectors are included there, which is a really big signal. We see all the work going on in all the different initiatives to help define actually what is a credible entity strategy or criteria, etc. Bringing this all together now, and the financial community is asking for it as well. It's like all the pieces of the puzzle are being built everywhere, and the connectivity, I think, is now really starting to happen to see that we can translate them into different uses and markets, essentially, which is the quite exciting thing to bring it together now. Yeah.
Stephen.
I think where we're going to go next is, I think that one of the real big benefits of just the rapid interest and growth in sustainable finance, in investor dollars flowing into ESG leadership and impact securities is going to really bring about issuers recognizing that there is a tremendously large and available pool of capital that is looking for investment opportunities that are more sustainable and that in general are available to all industries and all issuers, assuming they are willing to make the correct changes. And I think that you're going to combine that with the fact that we're seeing more and more evidence over time that being more sustainable helps to deliver better long-run results in fixed income for certain for investors. And that combination is really going to provide the impetus for the continued transition for everyone being more sustainable. 10 years ago, very few issuers were talking about or even discussing sustainability measures or metrics or their carbon footprint, whereas now everyone, even in the heavier industries, are releasing that type of information, generally speaking, and are interested in talking about it. So I think that bringing about of investment capital and the potential for everyone to recognize that, once again, everyone can do something to be more sustainable is really going to push us to that next level of seeing innovative solutions to improving the sustainability of the global economy.
Marissa,
And I think
champion of transition.
Yes. Well, I think to add to all the good words that have been said already is that the power of the investor dollar is such a big motivator for change. So maybe if I just point to very recent statements by the big gorilla BlackRock, they have said that they would like to see any company that they invest in subscribe to disclosure along the lines of SASB and TCFD. Now, if you think about that power, that is telling the corporates, I am demanding that you disclose that relevant information for your industry along a certain set of standards. What's going to happen? Investors, issuers will then disclose. Investors will have more confidence because it's a consistent event of data for you to look at and compare your investments against. And then we see more and more capital flowing in that direction toward the sustainable strategy. So I think to add to everything that everybody says, just a reminder of the power of investment dollars, not only to engage, but to ask for what you want, will create that behavior change, but also it'll create, I think, comfort in the markets to allow more and more of this capital to flow.
Fantastic perspective. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this session. Remember, you need to run, not walk. 10 years starting now. There's a lot to be done. The transitions part of it is a critical part of it. We've got a lot to do. We will be doing more with Credit Suisse and Climate Bonds and Transport Pathway Initiatives and so on this year to try and flesh out and make easier an understanding of what has to be done. But at the end of the day, we've got to do it. That's up to all of you out there, especially, as Marissa says, you investors, to drive this change. Thank you for being with us today. Remember, recordings will be available at climatebonds.net/webinars. Please do pass it on. Thank you very much, Adam, Stephen, Anna, Marissa, for taking time out today to share your thoughts with this global audience that we have. Good luck in creating a future for our children.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.